welcome to Council Watch. Different music and a different theme. Not remotely about council bashing or praising or sort of chastising the council members for what they do and don't do, but a little bit of history. We've talked recently about the Town Hall Project to do the building up that was frankly a bit of a wreck when Waverley District Council had it, and turn it into sort of a cultural centre, heritage, all that sort of stuff. Well, I've read all the documents and it's really nice. There's lots of stuff about, the history of Lowestoft as we sort of generally know it. But there's a darker side to the town hall. And its origins, the darker side, go back to the Cold War, when there was a pretty decent chance, most people seem to think, that we were going to be blown up by the Russians with nuclear bombs. We're talking about the period of time when we actually had American cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. We had our own nuclear arsenal. We had some American stuff as well. And this part of the country in particular was hardly a nuclear-free zone. We had an awful lot of stuff going on. And of course, back in those days, when we're talking about the 80s to when the Berlin Wall fell in the 90s, most of this was secret and nobody was told all about it. Now, I thought I'd let you know some of my recollections about how on earth the town hall in Lowestoft got mixed up in nuclear bombs. I'm probably going to have to keep some of the names a bit sort of protected here, I guess, but some of the people have passed away. So I guess I can tell the story with impunity, really. Back in the early 80s, I was involved with radio. I mean, basically, I was a radio hand back then. I still do radios today, but mostly it's for boats and things like that. But back then, that was what I did. And I was asked by a fella called Pete, who worked for Waverley District Council, if I would be willing to get involved with a radio project that was currently on the go in Suffolk. And it sort of intrigued me a bit, so I said, yeah, okay. And I was warned that I was going to have to sign the Official Secrets Act. Now, bear in mind that back in the 80s, the spy films that were on were all sort of cloak and dagger, and the Official Secrets Act was waived at anybody who was a sort of dissenting voice. And you could have crazy fines, and you could be put in prison if you spilled the beans about what was going on. So the Official Secrets Act in 1980 odd was a fairly serious thing. And Pete told me that I would have to sign this Official Secrets Act, which meant that I couldn't tell anybody what we did, couldn't tell anybody any of the interesting stuff that I'd discover, and certainly couldn't tell them about some of the places that I would probably have to visit. So I immediately said yes without any thought. I was in my 20s, so, this was adventure, I think. So I said, yeah, I'd get involved. Now, what it actually meant was that at the time, there was quite a lot of concern from the government that there was going to be a nuclear war with Russia. It would be sort of pretty well Europe and the Americans versus Russia. And things were a bit strange. I mean, if I digress for a moment, how strange they were was the fact that I was talking one day on a radio to a Russian guy. And on the BBC that morning, it had been reported that President Andropov had died in Russia. And I said to the Russian guy, I'm sorry to hear about President and he had no idea what I was talking about. The Russian people hadn't been told their own president had died. So that's how sort of weird things were back in the 80s. But to go back to our story in sunny Suffolk, well, what it was that the local councils, Waverley District Council in our case, were tasked with preparing and looking after the public if there was a nuclear bomb. Now, I mean, most people know a little bit about sort of, nuclear bombs, big mushroom clouds and stuff like that. But in actual fact, if you don't die from the blast, you probably are going to die from nuclear fallout. So the radiation's up in the sky, little particles land on you, and you die of radiation poisoning. I mean, that's basically sort of how it was expected to happen. And Waveney District Council were tasked with keeping as many of the public safe as they possibly could. So what they actually had were food depots. It was mainly preserved or canned food, and there were these depots dotted all about full of food that if everything sort of went badly, then the people who were sort of left to survive would be fed by the council, and they'd shift this stuff about to where it was needed. Now, the problem is you don't know where it's needed, do you? And that's where Lowestoft Town Hall came in. You may have heard of an organisation called the Royal Observer Corps, who were very active in the Second World War, spotting aeroplanes, that sort of stuff. And they were actually pressed into action in the 80s and early 90s to provide information. And the whole thing was extremely odd. Now, if any of you have seen Dad's Army, pretty much my experience of what was going on was very Dad's Army-ish. Best intentions, but a bit chaotic. So what do we have at the Lowestoft Town Hall? Well, we had a nuclear bunker. Now, back in the 80s, we were still talking about Sizewell then, but it wasn't Sizewell 3, it was the other Sizewells. And there was feeling that nuclear energy was a bit dangerous and a bit dodgy. And so it wasn't really the sort of thing that a council would be able to publicly support. In actual fact, I believe that Waveney at the time didn't support it at all. I mean, and certainly publicly were quite negative on the subject. So their nuclear bunker, which wasn't big, it was a little tiny place, down in the basement, walls about 3 feet thick, made of concrete, left over from the Second World War, and just sort of done up. And that bunker was shown on all the plans as a poll tax record storeroom. And on the shelf that they fitted to the wall were a couple of ring binders with some poll tax records in them. And so on all the plans, it just showed as a poll tax record storeroom. All the people that worked there knew exactly what it was, of course, but like everything else, they were civil servants and they kept their mouths shut. So in the basement was this small nuclear bunker, complete with the Perspex maps and seconded scientists from the Ministry of Ag on Kirkley Cliffs. So some of their scientists were, like me, had their arms twisted, and they'd go. And every first Sunday in the month, we'd practice bombs dropping on Suffolk. What that meant in practice was that the Royal Observer Corps had these little bunkers all over Norfolk and Suffolk, and they were in clusters of 3. And basically you shinned down a ladder. At the bottom of the ladder was a little chemical toilet, and then there was a smallish room. It had got a bunk at the end that you could actually have, people sleeping on. There was a little desk, and there was some very basic equipment installed. So basic that it's actually quite funny. At the top of the shaft, poking up above the ground, was a little 4-sided box, and inside some, what looked like ordinary graph paper. Think back to when you were at school, graph paper. And one faced north, south, east and west. And what actually happened was when a nuclear bomb exploded, the flash, which as you all know, I guess, is incredibly bright, would burn a little hole on the graph paper. And so inside the little bunker at the bottom was a big meter. And on the meter, it told you how big the blast was in terms of the pressure. So basically like a barometer, but a big one. So they knew how strong it was. And then someone would shin up the ladder, take the bit of burned graph paper out, put a bit of new graph paper in, go back down the thing, shut the lid, and then what they had was, looking at the graph paper, a bearing. So they knew which direction and how high the bomb was. They also knew how strong it was. So they got 4 things they needed. The direction in terms of a bearing, the elevation in terms of degrees, and pressure. These little Royal Observer Corps bunkers would be in reasonable proximity to each other. So you'd probably have Hopton, Corton, one a bit further inland, and that little cluster of 3 would coordinate their bearings and then one of them, which was designated as a master station, would then send that information via either radio or telephone wires, if they worked, to a central location. That would tell them where the bomb had gone off, because all you have to do is just collate all these on a big map. And that's pretty much what actually happened with the information that we'd get. So in Lowestoft bunker, we would actually get information about where a bomb had gone off and how big it was. And if you don't know anything about nuclear bombs, which I guess most people don't, they either land on the ground and go bang. They're very dirty then, because loads of stuff on the ground goes up. So all the soil, or if it was water, the water actually goes up. And of course, when it drops, it's irradiated. And that's the dangerous stuff. So the scientists would put X's on the map. They'd then look at where the wind was going to go. So if you've had a bomb go off over Bungay, I mean, quite why some of the places in our exercises were picked, I don't know. They weren't really military places. They'd be the most unusual places. But let's say a bomb went off in Bungay, but the actual wind was heading towards Lowestoft, then this gave the council a brief opportunity to shift people. So you would tell people to move. And perhaps if they went towards Ipswich or went towards Great Yarmouth, the radiation that's going to eventually start sort of dropping out of the sky on Lowestoft won't kill so many people. So that was the plan. So all these things would be collated, and we'd actually spend a Sunday morning drawing bombs on a map, and then Waveney District Council would talk to Suffolk County Council over the radio links that I was in charge of, and we'd try and organise things. People would then start to go and collect food and move it to where it was needed, or perhaps if the food was in a place where it's going to be contaminated, they'd move the food. It gave people a brief window in which to actually prepare a bit better. It wasn't a case of there's any space in the bunker for people, really, apart from the people who were working there. So it was very small. But the idea was that we would protect people. There were also other things going on in the area. Important places. Well, I mean, let's say places where people live. They needed to know what was going on. And let's be honest, I mean, if the TV and the radio things get blown up and they don't work, I mean, how do people get the information? Well, the system was quite a quaint one. In the country areas particularly, places like Somerleyton, how do you keep the people in Somerleyton informed? Well, what used to happen was that usually the postmaster, a reliable person, so you've got the postmaster of the village. He was given a little piece of equipment that very often was put under the stairs in his house or in the post office, and it ticked. And this thing just went tick, tick. You could turn it down, but you couldn't turn it off. The reason being that if it ticked, you knew it was connected. And if it's connected, you could get messages. And the messages actually came from police stations. And in most of the big police stations, there was, in their control room, a gizmo with 2 telephone handsets. 2, in case one didn't work. And basically what they would do is press a button, and then someone in the police station would say, "Attack warning red." And if they said that, it burst out of the loudspeaker in this little gizmo. The postmaster would then run outside with a little battery-operated maroon. Do you remember those batteries that had little springs on the top? PJ996s they were called. And once every sort of 4 or 5 months, a policeman would deliver to the postmaster a new set of batteries. And you put it in this gadget and you pressed a button on the top that said fire, and a little maroon went bang outside, which would tell all of the villagers that it was time to go and sort of panic a bit. The idea being that if tensions got really bad, people would know something was going on, and then the secrecy could be lifted, and the postmaster would then be allowed to tell all the people around him, watch out for a maroon. And he also had a World War II hand-cranked siren that went, and we had one of those. So that was the system, that the police would be told, attack warning red. It's on the way. The bombs are coming. They would then tell all the people. And so if the villagers would get it from the postmaster. If there wasn't a postmaster, it would usually be the pub, because the pub would be the centre of a village's activity. So the publican would be given the same gear. And that's how it worked. I mean, one of my jobs was to do training. And I had to go to a village where the postmaster had decided to have a rehearsal. And he had actually gone out and cranked his siren. And of course, lots of the elderly people in the village remembered what that meant in World War II. And panic ensued. They thought they were going to be bombed. He just decided to have an exercise on his own, and he had to be retrained. But nobody was allowed to know about these things. It was never talked about on the TV, certainly never talked about on the radio or the newspapers. It was a secret. So behind the scenes, you've got telling the public, you've got Waveney District Council. The system was actually meant to be used in civil emergencies too. So it could be sort of started up to get messages across the county of Suffolk and across the border into Norfolk. The system was quite complex. So although in Lowestoft we reported back to Ipswich, we didn't have any facility to talk to Norwich at all. We could talk across the border to Great Yarmouth. So we actually had that facility that we could do. Most times these messages were voice messages. But most of the important stuff, like the data for the scientists about where bombs had gone off, was actually done via teleprinters. And for any of you who are old enough to remember teleprinters, that's how we used to get the football results on a Saturday afternoon on the television. We actually had a camera pointing at a teleprinter that, like a typewriter, typed out the things. And those things were in our bunker. The rather strange thing, of course, is in the 1980s, there were no computers. We hadn't got them. No such thing as computers. So most of this stuff was all mechanical. And because of that, it was quite reliable. We did used to get ticked off quite often by Suffolk because they would ask us why we hadn't replied to a certain message. And we actually had to tell them that the walls of our bunker were 3 feet thick and the electricians had failed to get a drill through it to give us any more electricity. So if we needed to actually put the kettle on, we had to disconnect the teleprinter. And that's not a joke. That's exactly how it was. It was, as I said, very Dad's Army-ish. Now, as an aside to all this, I mentioned the Official Secrets Act. One Sunday, I turned up and one of my friends inside said, "There's 2 fellas inside, they want to see you." I thought, that's a bit odd, you know. Went in. And in this room, they'd moved the furniture about a bit, and sitting in the middle of the room was a chair. You know, like in the movies. There were 2 people. A younger guy who was probably in his 30s, so a little bit older than me at the time, and a more elderly chap. Probably, I reckon, looking back, about my age now. And he got very, very short grey hair. And he was wearing an immaculate suit. And I knew enough about suits to know that it was an extremely expensive one. And he just looked at me, didn't say a thing. The younger guy did all the talking. And he actually said, "You are Paul Robert Johnson." Now, when people mention your middle name, you know you're in trouble, don't you? So I said, yes. And I sat on this chair thinking, what on earth have I done? And basically, he asked me, had I been telling people about some of the things that we did in the town hall bunker? And I honestly said, yes, I've told some of my friends. Now, clearly, they must have told other people and it got back. I don't know who these people were. They didn't identify them in... they could have been policemen. I don't think so. Far too posh. I think they were probably the security services. I don't know, because they didn't ever identify themselves. And the young guy said, well, didn't I know that it under the Official Secrets Act, subsection so-and-so, paragraph so-and-so, telling people about what we did was an offence, punishable by so many months in prison or a big fine? And I said, well, sort of, yeah. He went, well, sort of. I said, well, I've never signed the Official Secrets Act. And the older chap sort of looked at me with a bit of a sort of surprised expression, and I told the young fella that they told us we'd all have to sign the Official Secrets Act and we'd do it the next Sunday. And the next Sunday, nothing happened. So none of us had actually signed the Official Secrets Act, apart from the guys who were there and were older. The scientists actually had, but the communications people, like me, we hadn't. So I told them we've never signed the Official Secrets Act. The two of them went out of the room, and I sat there and waited, and eventually put my head out the door, and my friend said, "They've gone." To this day, I have no idea who those people were, and I never did sign the Official Secrets Act. So, although I kept it quiet for a long time, I don't see any real problem with now telling people, because I don't think I'm doing anything wrong by recalling the events that we did at Lowestoft Town Hall. It was extremely odd, but one of the things that did concern all of us was the fact that if there was a nuclear bomb go off, we would all be expected to be in this bunker helping people we don't know keep safe. But what about our friends and family? There was no provision for them. There was no sort of seat in the bunker for your wife or anything like that. I would have been expected to leave them behind. And one of the people that was often there was a policeman. And he actually said one day that if this was for real, he wouldn't be there. He'd be with his wife and kids. And it made us all think a bit, because although it was a bit of a giggle, and I really enjoyed it, the actual reason for us being there was sort of end of the world-ish. Now, in actual fact, most of the targets in our area were not what people expected. You know, there's a lot of people not very keen on Sizewell, but oddly, in all of our scenarios that we played through, Sizewell never was a target. Now, the reason that I was told was because it's a no-win situation. You know, if you blow up a nuclear power station, it's useless to everybody and everybody's impacted. So nuclear power was never really a target in the Cold War. What were the American air bases and the RAF air bases. And we had dozens of them back then. In our neck of the wood, we were right in the middle of it, really. Think about it. We had Woodbridge and Bentwaters, the USAF bases, down near Ipswich, Honington, Coltishall, in our own area. And we also had the secret command control system at RAF Neatishead. Now, all the people who know Neatishead on the Broads sort of know it's there, you know, big aerials, big radar, there were all sorts of things over the years. It wasn't a secret, but it was a secret. In 1980, if you bought an ordnance survey map from the local stationers like Gerald's, it was very detailed, and RAF Neatishead was not on it. It was a secret. It was a secret that was in public view. Nobody actually knew officially that RAF Neatishead existed. Coltishall, with all the runways, yeah, fair enough, that's on all the maps. But RAF Neatishead wasn't. It was a secret. In actual fact, they had a very serious fire in RAF Neatishead. And there was all sorts of trouble because, you know, it's very difficult to keep a fire a secret. But officially, it should have been. And I think that was one of the only times I ever saw it mentioned in the press. And it was sort of something that sort of haunted the place for ages. Underground bunkers. Now, we didn't really have any of the big bunkers in our area. One at Norwich, in Barbara, one down on the Essex border, down that way. But we did have a number of other underground secret places. If you've ever gone to the theatre in Ipswich, in Rope Walk, it's next door to the police station. And underneath the police station is a very big nuclear bunker. A civil one. It wasn't intended for sort of, you know, government type people, but it would be where Suffolk County Council controlled all the things that happened in Suffolk. And it was underneath the police station. It had a place where people could sleep. It was pretty big, and it was nuclear blast proof. So if anything happened, that was where Suffolk sort of looked after its people. Norfolk, of course, had their own bunker, but they also had a number of other little ones as well. From memory, 2 in Norwich, 1 on the outskirts near the ring road. You can still see that if you actually drive past the ring road at the Borber end. You can see a big radio mast that pokes out the top, and the nuclear bunker is underneath that. There's also the other one on the inner ring road near the fire station, and that's been demolished. I think there's houses on it now. In Lowestoft, all we had was the town hall. We did have a little bunker at the bottom of Normanson Drive that lots of people thought was a bit suspicious, but really that was a World War II warden station. So it was a little bunker, but it wasn't anything to do with the nuclear sort of side of things. We didn't use it for that. Just the little one in Lowestoft Town Hall. Now, the one in the town hall, sadly, has been forgotten about. You know, the whole building has been turned into heritage, and they're looking back at the history of Lowestoft. And from what I can gather, there is no mention of recent history. You know, Lowestoft were preparing for nuclear destruction, and it was all being done from the basement of the Lowestoft Town Hall. Anyway, see you on the next video. Look after yourselves.